He grabbed my wrist and tried to unlock my phone with my own face in front of the entire leadership team. That was the moment I understood this had nothing to do with protecting data. It was about who got to cross lines without consequences. And Damon Crowder had just assumed he could. I'm Ruby Dean, Senior Data Privacy and Compliance Officer, the person responsible for safeguarding over 200 enterprise clients and nearly $500 million in active contracts. My role was quiet by design, no headlines, no applause, just systems that prevented things from breaking. Damon preferred visible power. He believed authority meant access, and access meant ownership. Hold still, he said, tightening his grip like procedure didn't apply to him. I pulled back. Steady. That device is personal property. You don't have consent. You don't have authority. Silence spread across the room, the kind that makes people suddenly fascinated with their screens. Damon smiled like he'd been waiting for resistance. Then you're terminated. Effective immediately. Just like that. No process, no discussion, just ego wrapped in policy language. I placed my badge on the table, careful and precise, around us. Legal avoided eye contact. IT kept typing, and no one said what they were all thinking. What happens when the person who enforces the rules is no longer in the room? What Damon didn't understand was simple. My phone wasn't hiding anything. It was part of a control layer he had never bothered to learn. As I walked out, he turned to IT. Mirror everything she had. I want full visibility. One of them hesitated. That could trigger, do it. I didn't turn back. Because systems like mine don't raise their voices. They record. And once they start recording, the consequences don't stay in the room, they travel fast. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what the temperature is like there right now. This is a fictional story, with some elements enhanced by AI to make the experience more immersive and engaging. Now, let me walk you through what really happened. What they never noticed was how much of their stability had my fingerprints on it. For 6 years, I built the data breach early warning system from scratch layer by layer, rule by rule, until it quietly protected over $480 million in active contracts and more than 200 enterprise clients. It didn't make headlines. It didn't need to. It just worked, intercepting risks before anyone else even knew they existed. Damon Crowder called it something else. Bureaucratic noise. He said during his first week, leaning back like governance was optional. He didn't understand the system, but that never stopped him from cutting it. Within a month, he slashed the security budget by 40% and demanded full, unrestricted access to client data, as if authority could override liability. This wasn't his first time ignoring warnings either. There had been 3 separate incidents, 3 clear alerts my system had flagged. Each time, Damon dismissed them. Each time, I stepped in quietly, contained the risk, and kept the clients from ever finding out. He called that overreaction. I called it prevention. The gap between us wasn't skill. It was respect for rules, for consequences, for things that don't forgive mistakes. By the time he fired me, that gap had already become a fault line. Later that same day, I heard what happened next. Damon turned to IT impatient. Mirror her phone access. I want everything she had. There was a pause. A real one this time. One of the engineers spoke carefully. That would trigger a compliance flag. Damon didn't hesitate. Do it anyway, by the time I got home. The silence felt heavier than the confrontation. The termination email was already waiting in my inbox brief. Clinical, and carefully worded to sound lawful without actually being careful. I read it once, then closed it. No reply, no appeal. There was nothing to argue with. The decision had already exposed what mattered and what didn't. Instead, I opened my laptop and logged into the personal dashboard I had built as a redundant oversight layer. Not company property, not something Damon Crowder even knew existed. Just a quiet mirror of system integrity, read only, untouchable, and brutally honest. At first, there was nothing unusual. Then the logs began to populate. Unauthorized access attempt. A few seconds later, policy override initiated. I leaned back, watching the entries appear in real time. Each one timestamped, each one irreversible. The system wasn't reacting emotionally, it was documenting behavior, exactly as it had been designed to do. And then it clicked. Damon hadn't just fired me. He had replaced controlled oversight with forced access by ordering IT to mirror my phone. He had bypassed the consent layer tied to protected data pathways. That wasn't a shortcut. That was the threshold. The data breach early warning system didn't activate based on intent. It activated based on conditions, and Damon had just satisfied all of them. For a moment, the weight of my own situation pressed back in. My savings weren't built for long-term unemployment. The mortgage notice sitting unopened on the kitchen counter suddenly felt louder than anything Damon had said. Walking away had been the right decision, but it wasn't the easy one. Still, I didn't move to interfere. I didn't need to, because once the system crossed that line, it didn't wait for approval. It followed protocol. I refreshed the dashboard one more time. A new line appeared. Clean and final, protocol armed. The first crack didn't sound like a collapse. It sounded like confusion. By the next morning, 12 of our enterprise clients had already reached out, each one asking the same careful question, in slightly different words, what exactly had happened to their data. No accusations yet. Just concern, but in my world, concern was always the first signal that trust was shifting. Inside the company, legal moved faster than usual. Internal review threads opened, audit requests were filed, and compliance logs were quietly pulled for verification. No one announced it out loud, but the tone had changed. People were no longer managing optics. They were tracing liability. Damon Crowder, however, treated it like background noise. Just a glitch, he said in a leadership call, his voice carrying the same casual certainty he used when cutting safeguards he didn't understand. Systems overreact. That's what they do. But systems like mine didn't overreact. They recorded, and what they had recorded couldn't be adjusted, softened, or rewritten to fit a better narrative. The compliance logs were immutable by design. Each entry sealed the moment it was created. More importantly, the audit trail didn't just capture actions, it captured identity. Every override request, every access attempt, every escalation, all of it pointed to one name, Damon Crowder. By mid-morning, the internal tension had sharpened into something more precise. ET stopped speculating. Legal stopped asking hypothetical questions. They were no longer wondering if something had happened. They were mapping exactly how it had happened and who had authorized it. I watched it unfold from a distance. Still outside the system, but not disconnected from it. The dashboard remained quiet. But not idle. It was processing, correlating, aligning thresholds that had already been crossed. Then, just after noon, a new sequence appeared. Not an alert, a preparation, an outbound notification queue, structured, formatted, and waiting for final execution. I read the subject line once, then again, slower this time. Potential unauthorized data access detected. No emotion, no accusation, just language designed to trigger action on the receiving end. And once those emails were sent, this wouldn't be confusion anymore. It would be consequence. Let me ask you something. If you think Damon Crowder was right to force access to a personal device and override compliance controls just to get what he wanted, comment reasonable. But if you don't support that kind of decision, ignoring rules and crossing legal boundaries, then comment unreasonable. I'm really curious to see where you stand. The cascade didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded in layers, each one heavier than the last. By early afternoon, the notification queue had expanded from 12 concerned clients to the full list 200 enterprise accounts flagged under the same protocol. The system wasn't accusing anyone. It didn't need to. It was doing exactly what regulations required. When specific thresholds were met, initiate precautionary disclosure. And that single step changed everything. Under compliance guidelines, those clients now had an obligation of their own. They couldn't continue normal operations while a potential data exposure was under review. Contracts paused. Transactions stalled. Access pathways tightened. Not because of panic, but because of policy. Inside the company. The impact was immediate. The pipeline, $220 million, tied to active deals, froze in place. Not delayed, not at risk, frozen. The kind of stillness that doesn't show up in dashboards right away, but spreads through calls, emails, and silence on the other end of negotiations. I could almost picture the room, the CFO standing there, trying to make sense of numbers that no longer moved. Sales leads refreshing reports that refused to update. Operations waiting for instructions that no longer mattered. And at the center of it, Damon Crowder, still convinced this was something he could manage. "We control the narrative," he said, pushing the words like they could reshape reality. But narratives don't override compliance, and systems like mine don't wait for approval once conditions are met. They execute, by the time legal stepped in. The situation had already moved beyond interpretation. They weren't asking what to say. They were determining what had already been said automatically, consistently, and without bias. I watched the progression through the dashboard, each status update confirming what I already knew. This wasn't escalation driven by emotion. It was escalation driven by design. Then the internal call transcript surfaced short, precise, and final. Damon insisting they could still manage perception. Legal responding without hesitation. "No, the system does." And just like that, control shifted completely. The emails went out exactly as the system intended, quiet, precise, and impossible to misinterpret. There was no accusation in the language, no dramatic wording, just a structured notification, carefully aligned with regulatory standards, potential risk. 2 words designed to inform, not alarm, but in enterprise environments. That distinction doesn't matter. Risk, even potential, triggers action, and action came fast. Within hours, responses began to shift. Clients didn't argue. They didn't wait for clarification. They followed protocol. Internal reviews were initiated on their side. Access permissions were tightened, and ongoing operations were paused. Not because they believed something had gone wrong, but because they couldn't afford to assume nothing had. That was the part Damon Crowder never understood. Trust doesn't disappear in a single moment. It withdraws methodically, following rules just like everything else. By the end of the first day, dozens of accounts had already suspended activity. By the second, the pattern was undeniable, one by one, then in clusters. 200 enterprise clients disengaged from the system I had once built to protect them. No shutdown, no crash, just absence. 48 hours later, the numbers spoke for themselves. Entire segments of the business had gone silent. Pipelines emptied. Communication threads stopped mid-sentence. The infrastructure was still running, but there was nothing left moving through it. Inside the company, that silence finally broke. Who authorized this? Damon's voice cut through a meeting that no longer had answers to offer. It wasn't a question about process. It was a demand for someone to blame. But blame doesn't rewrite logs, and authority doesn't erase recorded actions. The room didn't respond immediately, not because they didn't know, but because they did. Then the CFO spoke. Calm, measured, and unmistakably clear. "You did. When you bypassed compliance. No anger, no emphasis, just a statement of fact." And in that moment, the system didn't just prove it was working, it proved it had never needed permission to begin with. The collapse didn't arrive with noise, it arrived with numbers no one could explain away. By the time the board stepped in, the situation had already outgrown internal damage control. What had started as a compliance review was now a full-scale operational failure, and the scale of it forced attention at the highest level. Reports were compiled overnight. Emergency briefings were scheduled. Every department was suddenly accountable for something they could no longer influence. $310 million in active contracts were now frozen, locked in place by precautionary clauses that no one could override. Nearly 40% of the company's strategic clients had either paused or fully withdrawn engagement, not out of anger, Not even out of distrust. Out of obligation. That was the difference. Inside the boardroom, the conversation shifted from explanation to exposure. Executives who had once deferred to Damon Crowder were now careful with their words, choosing precision over loyalty. No one defended the outcome. They only tried to distance themselves from it. And then, for the first time, someone asked the question that should have been asked much earlier. Where is she? It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. My absence had finally become visible, not as a missing employee, but as a missing function, something essential that had been removed without understanding what it actually did. No one answered immediately, because answering that question meant admitting something deeper than a staffing mistake. It meant acknowledging that the system had been working and that someone had chosen to interfere with it. Legal moved next. They didn't speculate. They didn't argue. They presented. A sequence of internal communications appeared: emails, flagged reports, escalation notices, each one time-stamped, each one acknowledged, each one quietly warning about the exact risks now unfolding. All of them sent by me, and all of them received by Damon. There was a pause as the room processed it, not the content, but the pattern. Then legal said it, evenly, without accusation. These warnings were issued, and they were ignored. No raised voices, no dramatic reactions, just clarity, and in that clarity, the collapse finally made sense. The attempt to reverse it didn't begin with strategy. It began with panic disguised as control. By the time the boardroom settled into damage assessment, Damon Crowder had already moved ahead on his own. He drafted reassurance emails, carefully worded statements meant to soften the impact without admitting fault. He pushed them out in waves, insisting the situation was under review, that no confirmed breach had occurred, that operations would normalize shortly. At the same time, he started calling the largest accounts personally, one by one. The same clients who had trusted the system for years now listened in silence as he tried to rebuild confidence with explanations he didn't fully understand. He spoke about safeguards, about oversight, about internal corrections already in progress. But trust doesn't return because someone asks for it, and compliance doesn't reset because someone needs it to. The responses came back consistent, almost rehearsed, not because the clients coordinated, but because the logic was identical. We don't trust your compliance integrity anymore. No anger, no escalation, just withdrawal. That was the moment the situation shifted from recoverable to irreversible. And that was when Damon finally turned his attention back to me. I saw his name appear on my phone first, then the messages, then the email marked urgent, each one more direct than the last. No apology, no acknowledgement, just urgency wrapped in expectation, as if I were still part of a system he could command. I let it ring, not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. Eventually, I answered. There was no introduction on his end, no attempt at pretense. "Fix it," he said, like the last 48 hours hadn't happened. I took a breath, not to calm down, but to stay precise. I didn't break anything. A pause. Then sharper, then stop it. That was the part he still didn't understand. I hadn't triggered anything. I hadn't blocked anything. I hadn't interfered at all. So I told him the only truth that mattered. The system is doing exactly what it was built to do. The unraveling didn't come as a surprise. It came as confirmation. By the time the internal audit concluded, every assumption had been replaced with documented fact. There was no ambiguity left, no room for interpretation. The findings were structured, precise, and aligned with the same compliance framework Damon Crowder had dismissed as unnecessary. He had violated company policy, not once, but repeatedly. The report outlined everything in sequence: his demand for unauthorized access to my personal device, the forced override of established security controls, and the direct instruction to bypass compliance safeguards. Each action linked clearly to the next, forming a chain that led exactly where the system said it would. To consequence, there was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices echoing through conference rooms, just decisions made in controlled environments by people who now understood the cost of ignoring structure. Damon was terminated. This time. Properly, no shortcuts, no theatrics. Just the same procedural authority he had once tried to bypass applied to him. And it didn't end there. Because policy violations at that level don't stay internal. The audit findings triggered further review, extending beyond the company into formal legal scrutiny. External investigators became involved. Not to speculate, but to verify what had already been recorded. Damon hadn't just made a mistake. He had created liability, from a distance. I watched it unfold without interruption, not detached, but clear. The system had done its job. The organization had followed through, and for the first time since this began, everything aligned with how it should have worked from the start. Then, unexpectedly, my phone rang again. Different number this time, the board. Their tone was careful, measured in a way that suggested both urgency and respect. They didn't ask where I had been. They asked if I would come back, not to resume my old role, but to take control of the entire compliance structure, with full authority to rebuild what had been compromised. For a moment, I said nothing, because power, when it returns, never looks the same. In the end, the power they offered me back felt smaller than the power I had already proven I held. The board's proposal was generous, full authority, direct reporting lines, control over every compliance function Damon Crowder had dismantled. On paper, it was everything I should have wanted. Restoration, recognition, control. But control, I had learned, isn't something you accept after it's taken from you. It's something you define on your own terms. So I declined. Not out of anger, not even out of pride, out of clarity. Within weeks, I transitioned into independent consulting, advising firms that understood the cost of ignoring structure before they had to experience it firsthand. My rates reflected that understanding triple what I had earned before, and for the first time. No one questioned the value behind them, because now, the lesson wasn't theoretical, it was documented. One afternoon, I found myself standing across the street from the building I used to walk into every day. The same glass exterior, the same quiet efficiency. From the outside, nothing had changed, but I knew better. The system I had built was still running, still precise, still indifferent, still doing exactly what it was designed to do. The difference was, now they respected it, not because they chose to, because they had to. I stayed there for a moment longer, not reflecting, just observing. Then I turned away, already moving forward, because in the end, the truth had never been complicated. They didn't lose control because I left. They lost it because they never understood who held it, and that was the part no title could ever replace. Before we close this story, I want to ask you something. If you would have made the same choice as me, walking away and building your own path, instead of going back, comment yes. If you wouldn't, feel free to write no. And if you're still thinking it through, just write time. I'd really like to know what you would have done in my place. I didn't win because I fought louder. I won because I understood what truly held everything together. This experience taught me that real power isn't about titles, access, or authority. It lives in the systems you build, the standards you protect, and the boundaries you refuse to compromise. When you know your value, you don't need to prove it, you let reality do that for you. If you've been listening this far, take a moment for yourself. Sit back, stretch a little, maybe stand up and walk around. Let your mind breathe after everything you've just taken in. And if this story meant something to you, if it made you think, reflect, or feel seen, consider subscribing. Not just for me, but for a community that values clarity, integrity, and quiet strength. Leave a comment and share where you're listening from. Like and share this story if you believe more people deserve to understand their worth. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.